The house that followed. Pete wasn't the kind of guy who got scared easily. He had lived on the darker side of the internet, burrowed deep into the shadows where the worst kinds of people did their worst kinds of work. He had been one of them once, a hacker with a talent for finding holes in systems and prying them open like soft fruit. He knew how to steal information, how to ruin lives with a few keystrokes. He was good at it too, until he got sloppy and found himself in handcuffs one rainy morning with 2 FBI agents reading him his rights. He had a choice, prison or cooperation. He chose to cooperate, and now he was a cybersecurity consultant, using the same skills that had once made him rich and dangerous to keep others safe. That's why, when the strange things started happening after his stay at that Airbnb, Pete didn't panic. At first, the stay itself had been uneventful. Clean house, quiet neighborhood, a little too quiet maybe. He remembered how odd it had been to never see another person on the street. The host had been polite but distant. A thin woman named Emily, who had met him at the door, handed him the key and left without much conversation. The house had that stale, chemical-clean smell that suggested too much bleach and not enough life. But nothing weird had happened while he was there. No strange noises, no power outages, no hidden cameras in the vents. He slept well. He left a 5-star review. A week after the stay, Pete woke up in the middle of the night and saw the cursor on his laptop moving on its own. He rubbed his eyes, thinking maybe he was dreaming. But no, it was moving, slowly, deliberately. Someone was digging through his files. He watched in stunned silence as windows opened and closed. His email, his saved passwords, his work documents. His heart thudded in his chest. He slammed the laptop shut, yanked out the battery, and sat there in the dark, breathing hard. He ran a diagnostic on his phone and discovered that someone had installed an app beneath the operating system, something hidden so deep that it bypassed all normal security protocols. They had full access to his microphone, camera, and location. More alarming, they had downloaded his contact list, family, friends, co-workers. They knew everyone he knew. Pete sat very still and stared at the dark screen of his phone, feeling the first trace of real fear creep up his spine. Pete was good at his job, better than good, but whoever had done this was better. Military-grade encryption, masked IP addresses bouncing through multiple continents. He couldn't even get close to the source. That's when he realized that whoever was behind this had made a mistake. They had gotten greedy. They had left just enough of a trail for him to follow if he was willing to take the risk. Pete knew the only way to catch them in the act was to go back. He needed to lure them out, force them to reveal themselves. So he did what any sane person wouldn't do. He booked the Airbnb again. He created a fake business trip, booked the same dates, used a new email and credit card to avoid suspicion. But sure enough, the same host, Emily, confirmed his booking immediately. When Pete arrived at the house, nothing had changed. Same clean smell, same eerie quiet. Emily handed him the key, smiled politely, and left without a word. Pete unpacked his gear and got to work. He installed a backdoor into the house's Wi-Fi router using a custom script. If someone tried to access his laptop or phone, he would trace the signal in real time. Hours passed. Pete sat in the dark, waiting. Just after 3 a.m., the cursor on his laptop began to move. Whoever it was, they were good, real good. They bypassed his encryption protocols and dug into his files within seconds. Pete's software locked onto the source and traced it through a chain of masked relays. The final IP address pinged back to Shanghai, China. Pete frowned, staring at the screen. He backtraced the connection and discovered that the attack originated from a well-known organ transplant hospital in Shanghai. Not just any hospital, the nation's best. The kind of place that high-ranking government officials and billionaires went when they needed a new liver or heart. Pete leaned back, mind racing. What would an Airbnb in Seattle have to do with an organ transplant hospital in China? Pete spent the next week combing through the internet, searching for any connections between the hospital and Seattle. That's when he had another idea. He used his old black hat skills to scrape Airbnb's back-end database. He built a list of every guest who had stayed at the house in the last year. 37 names. Pete cross-referenced those names against public records, social media, and news reports. 6 of them were missing, gone without a trace. No signs of struggle, no police investigations. They had just disappeared. Pete felt cold as he dug deeper. 3 of those missing guests had been registered organ donors. 2 others had suspicious medical records involving tissue-matching tests. And the 6th had recently been reported dead from natural causes, despite being a healthy 32-year-old marathon runner. His body was cremated before an autopsy could be performed. Pete sat there, breathless. This wasn't about hacking. This was about harvesting. Pete hacked into the hospital's private network in Shanghai, a feat that should have been impossible. The system was locked down tighter than the Pentagon. But Pete was relentless. He found a secure folder labeled donor profiles. Hundreds of files, names, ages, blood types, genetic profiles. Attached to each file were medical reports, flight itineraries, and accommodation records. Pete's heart pounded as he recognized the names of several people from his list of missing Airbnb guests. Their files were marked as harvested. His hands trembled as he opened one of the files. There were detailed logs of tissue compatibility tests, organ extraction dates, and post-operative outcomes. Each person had been matched with a patient in the Shanghai hospital, a billionaire, a politician, a tech CEO. Pete sat back, horrified. They were selecting guests based on genetic compatibility. They were running DNA tests on guests through the Airbnb, probably hidden in the water, the air, the cleaning products. That's how they knew who to target. And once they found a match, the guest would disappear. Their organs flown halfway across the world. Pete stared at the screen as the magnitude of it settled in. This wasn't some rogue operation. This was systemic, organized, protected, and then his laptop shut off. His phone went dark. Every light in his apartment flickered and died. A low hum filled the air. Pete stood, heart hammering, and looked out the window. A white van sat parked across the street. A man in a gray hoodie leaned against the driver's side door, looking directly at Pete's window. Pete stepped back, pulse hammering in his ears. His phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen. "You shouldn't have looked, Pete." Pete ran for the door, but he knew deep down that it was already too late. A few days later, Pete sat in the dark, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard as lines of code blurred across the screen. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. He'd been at this for hours, digging deeper into the hospital's network, following a trail that had led him to places he wished he'd never seen. Encrypted files, ghost protocols, scrubbed metadata. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury this information, but Pete was better. He bypassed firewall after firewall, finally breaking through into a hidden subdirectory. A single folder labeled custody transfers. Pete opened it. Names, dates, ages. His stomach twisted. He scrolled down. Female, 7 years old, transferred. Male, 6 years old, transferred. Female, 9 years old, transferred. Status, missing. Pete's breath quickened as he opened the attached files. Photos of children, smiling school pictures, candid shots from birthday parties. Innocent faces now marked with cold medical details, blood type, genetic markers, tissue compatibility. Next to some of the profiles were grim updates. Harvested. Pete squeezed his eyes shut. He forced himself to keep reading. Many of the files were tagged with intake locations, U.S. Border Patrol, Immigration and Naturalization Services. These weren't random kidnappings. These were systematic extractions. Children pulled from government custody, funneled into a network that ended with organ transplants, trafficking, or worse. Pete dug deeper. He traced secure communications between the hospital and anonymous offshore accounts. Payments in the tens of millions. He traced the money back to holding companies tied to well-known names, billionaires, senators, CEOs, the elite, the untouchable. Then he found it, a file buried under a secondary encryption layer, tagged with a single strange identifier, Epstein preferred. Pete's breath caught as he opened it. A list of names, celebrities, politicians, royals. There were detailed records of financial transactions, millions funneled to a secure offshore server located in the Caribbean. Pete backtraced the IP address. It pinged back to a private server on a secluded island. Epstein's island. Pete leaned back, hands trembling. Even dead, Epstein's network was still alive, still running. The cursor on his screen froze. A low hum filled the air. Pete's screen flickered. Then a message appeared, "You know too much." Pete's heart seized. He yanked the laptop's battery, stood, and grabbed the hard drive he'd been backing up to. He shoved it into his bag. His phone buzzed. A single message, "We're coming." Pete ran. He was already 3 blocks away when he heard the low growl of an engine. A black SUV rolled past him, slowing just enough for Pete to see the driver, clean-shaven, sunglasses, and earpiece. The man looked at him, smiled faintly, then drove on. Pete cut through a side street, heart racing. He stopped under a dead street lamp, breathing hard. He pulled out his burner phone, dialed a number he hadn't called in 20 years. "Hello? It's Pete," he said, voice flat. A long silence, then a sigh. "Christ, what have you done? I'm sending you something, you know what to do." Another pause. But Pete had already ended the call. He slipped into an alley, pulled out a small USB drive and set it on fire with a cheap Bic lighter. He crushed the remains under his heel. The real data was already uploaded to a secure cloud server under an encrypted protocol only his old FBI handler would know how to access. Pete knew it wouldn't be enough. He knew they would try to clean it up, pay off the right people, erase the right evidence, but he had left a trail this time. Someone would find it. Maybe. Another black SUV rolled by. Pete melted into the shadows. By sunrise, he was gone. His apartment empty. His online profiles deleted. His bank accounts drained. Pete disappeared off the grid like smoke through a vent. Somewhere, in a high-rise penthouse on the other side of the world, a tech billionaire checked his phone and smiled faintly at the news alert. Seattle man reported missing. Pete was gone. The conspiracy remained. Media. The bacon at Maze. Will had been driving for hours, the hypnotic pulse of the white-striped center lane pulling him deeper into a trance as the road stretched endlessly before him. Northern New Mexico was a vast, empty place at 3 a.m., where the black sky swallowed the land whole, and the only sound was the low hum of his rig pushing forward through the void. He liked the solitude, preferred it even. But tonight, there was something else in the air, something he couldn't quite name. A weight, an unseen presence pressing in on him. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in hours. He reached for his ham radio, his voice breaking the silence as he asked if there was a good place for breakfast near Clovis. The response came almost instantly, a whispery, smoky voice crackling through his headset, sounding so close it might as well have been breathing against his neck. "Try Mace Breakfast Diner. They're open all night. You should see it in 20 minutes on your right. But you'll need to park your rig on the shoulder after the exit." Will felt a shiver creep up his spine. He hadn't said where he was. He hadn't given any indication of his location. The voice sounded old, rasping, almost amused. Still, the promise of hot food overruled his unease, and sure enough, as promised, the neon glow of Maze appeared in the distance, flickering in and out through the dark. The moment he saw it, a strange feeling settled in his gut. Something wasn't quite right. He pulled off, parked on the shoulder as instructed, and made his way inside. The place had the warm, comforting atmosphere of an old truck stop diner, the kind that felt like a relic of the past, complete with faded red booths and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Yet, the silence felt unnatural, like a stage set waiting for actors to arrive. A waitress greeted him with a tired but genuine smile, handed him a menu, but urged him to try the bacon sampler. "You'll love it," she said, almost too eagerly. "It's what we're known for." He ordered a ham steak, 3 eggs, hash browns, and the sampler, reasoning that if he couldn't finish it, he'd wrap some up for later. When the food arrived, it was everything he wanted and more, but the bacon. The bacon was otherworldly, thick-cut, perfectly crisp, rich, smoky, and yet something about it was different, indescribably good. He had never tasted anything like it before. Each bite filled him with an almost primal satisfaction. like scratching an itch he never knew he had. "What's in this?" he asked the waitress, his voice slightly breathless. She smiled knowingly. "How special? Been in the family for years. Recipe came from the owner's grandpa. We've been serving it here forever." As he drove the next day, he couldn't stop thinking about the bacon. The taste lingered on his tongue like an old memory, gnawing at him. It was an obsession now. He had to have more. 2 nights later, as he made his way back toward Clovis, the ham radio crackled to life. The same smoky, disembodied voice slithered into his ears. "How was the bacon?" Will's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't spoken, hadn't reached for the radio. Yet the voice knew. He gripped the wheel tighter, his pulse hammering against his skin. Minutes later, a state trooper's lights flared in his mirrors. He pulled over, heart still racing from the eerie transmission. The officer approached and leaned in, inspecting his rig. "License plate lights out," he said. "Just a warning this time, but get it fixed soon." Then, almost as an afterthought, the officer cocked his head. "Did you try the bacon?" Will felt a cold sweat break across his skin. "What's with the bacon?" he asked, his voice wavering. The officer chuckled, as if Will had just asked the most obvious question in the world. "That diner's famous all over the 4 corners. Can't get enough of that bacon myself." Over the next few days, Will tried to push it from his mind, but it was impossible. The craving had sunk its claws into him. He found himself dreaming of it, waking up in the middle of the night with the phantom taste of it still lingering on his tongue. It was more than just a want, it was a need. The world started to feel muted, dull, when he wasn't thinking about it. Food tasted like ash, and so, 1 week later, he found himself back on that lonely stretch of highway, the neon glow of maze cutting through the darkness. But something was different. There were no other cars in the lot, no sign of life, yet the open sign buzzed weakly against the window. He stepped inside. The air smelled the same, but the atmosphere was off. The waitress from before was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a wiry old man stood behind the counter, his skin ashen, his eyes sunken and lifeless. "Back for more?" the man rasped, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Will hesitated, but the hunger gnawed at him. "Yeah," he admitted. "I need more of that bacon." The old man nodded, turning toward the kitchen. "Wait here." Will sat in the booth, his foot tapping anxiously. The place felt wrong now, like a trap, like he was being watched. Minutes passed. Then the sound of heavy boots echoed from the kitchen. A door creaked open, and 2 men stepped out, dressed in butcher's aprons, their hands glistening with something dark and wet. The old man placed a plate in front of him, fresh bacon piled high. "On the house," he said. Will stared at it, a strange dread pooling in his stomach. The meat glistened under the flickering fluorescent lights, the scent intoxicating, undeniable. But then, he saw it. A fingernail. A small, jagged sliver of something human embedded in the crispy folds. His stomach lurched. The waitress's words came back to him. "Been in the family for years." The state trooper's knowing smile. "Can't get enough of that bacon." The disembodied voice on the radio. "How was the bacon?" His breath hitched. A war raged inside him. He should leave. He should run. He should be disgusted, horrified, appalled. But the hunger was unbearable. His fingers twitched as he reached for the plate. The old man and the butchers watched, waiting, their expressions unreadable. Will picked up a strip of bacon. It was still warm. He hesitated for only a second. Then he ate. The taste sent a shiver through his body. Ecstasy. Fulfillment. His entire being hummed with satisfaction. He didn't care anymore. Didn't care what it was, where it came from, what it meant. None of it mattered. Only the bacon. "Welcome home, Will." Will got back in his truck and started to leave town, but alas, he was pulled over by the same state trooper. "You didn't fix the license plate light like I asked. Now I have to take you in," the officer said as he reached for his handcuffs. "Arrested? For a light out?" Will knew better than to argue. The cop car started heading back, toward May's diner. The officer turned his head and spoke to Will, now cuffed in the back seat. "You are a part of it now." As the car stopped, the 2 butchers from before opened the door and pulled Will out. They never found him. His truck sat abandoned on the side of the highway for 4 weeks until the company tracked it by GPS. Now there's no trace of Will, but the neon sign at May's Diner blinks. Open, open, open.